The early morning light spilled weakly over the Jefferson County Courthouse, transforming the once stately building into a theater of quiet chaos. A cacophony of hurried footsteps, murmured legal jargon, and the clatter of rolling briefcases filled the air. The scent of musty, time-worn volumes mingled with bitter notes of burnt coffee, and every whisper seemed to carry an undercurrent of urgency. This was no ordinary day. It was a battleground where hope and injustice locked horns before the day had fully awoken. Daryl Carter had trodden these halls before, but never as a plaintiff fighting for his own cause. Today, dressed in a sharply tailored gray suit with a perfectly knotted navy tie and a worn brown leather briefcase clutched under his arm, he stepped into the fray, a seasoned businessman caught in the relentless gears of a legal dispute over a long-forgotten contract. Each step he took resonated with the weight of past battles, yet the uncertainty of this day loomed like an unspoken challenge. Inside the vestibule, a line of hopeful souls surged forward like a living tide, each clutching a bundle of paperwork that bore their fate. With a practiced nod, one by one, they surrendered their documents to an indifferent clerk before being ushered through double doors into the labyrinthine corridors of justice. Some left with tentative smiles, a fragile promise of victory, while others, their faces etched with worry, hurried on as if fleeing a silent storm. Daryl watched them all, his eyes tracing the subtle dance between hope and despair. When his turn arrived at a weathered check-in desk manned by a broad-shouldered officer whose tired eyes and graying hair betrayed years of unspoken battles, Daryl offered his documents with quiet determination. The officer's gaze flickered lazily over the pages, his movements mechanical, until a moment of unnerving pause stretched between them. Finally, in a tone so even it almost melted into the background hum, the man said, "Daryl Carter, you'll have to wait outside." A dismissive gesture, an arcing hand toward a row of cold, metal benches, sealed his fate, and with a reluctant nod, Daryl accepted his exile to that hard, unyielding perch. Settling onto the bench, Daryl's fingers drummed a restless rhythm against his briefcase. Glancing at his watch, 8:47 a.m., it seemed as if time itself was in a slow-motion dance, each tick amplifying his quiet discontent. Was this waiting merely an administrative quirk, or did it signal something far more sinister? As the minutes passed, the patterns in the crowd began to etch themselves into his consciousness. Faces that mirrored his own, shadows of the same struggle, sat huddled and waiting. Meanwhile, those who did not share his hue breezed past the same threshold with effortless speed. A navy-clad white gentleman, his attire crisp and unassuming, advanced next to the desk with a bulky manila folder in hand. In barely 15 seconds, his papers received a cursory glance, and he was whisked away into the maze of courtrooms. Soon after, a young blonde in a beige pencil skirt and immaculate white blouse appeared, greeted with a warm smile and sent on her way within 10 heartbeats. Each interaction left Daryl's pulse thumping a bit louder, a silent drumbeat of mounting injustice. As he sat, uneasy and observant, a man in a dignified brown suit with temples dusted and gray sidled up beside him. The man's weathered face, lined with years of courtroom battles, held a quiet understanding. "What's your case?" he inquired in a low, measured tone. Daryl replied tersely, "Business dispute." The man's knowing nod seemed to speak volumes, an unspoken camaraderie among those who had learned to read the unsteady script of bureaucracy. Before any further words could be exchanged, a stately black woman in a bold red blazer, clutching a slim folder, approached the desk. With barely a glance, the officer muttered an indistinct remark and swept her aside with the same dismissive gesture that had condemned Daryl to the bench. The woman's shoulders slumped in weary resignation as she sank onto the far end of the row, her silent protest etched in the firm set of her jaw as she scrolled absently on her phone. 10 minutes drifted into 20 as the line continued to swell. Daryl's pulse became a steady metronome against the cold metal of his seat. Then, right at 9:15 a.m., the delicate balance was shattered. A balding white man in an expensive charcoal suit stormed in, muttering about lateness as he brandished a folder with the confidence of entitlement. "Courtroom B, right?" he muttered, barely interrupting his brisk stride. With a casual nod from the officer, who seemed to perform his duty with a detached indifference, the man was allowed passage with the lifting of an unseen rope. His name? Mr. Hayes. Daryl's frustration coalesced into a quiet fury. Rising abruptly, he called out, "Excuse me." His voice, though controlled, carried the weight of 45 minutes of neglect. "What about me? I've been waiting for almost an hour." The officer's eyes, at last meeting Daryl's, flickered with a mix of annoyance and smug finality. "You'll be called when they're ready," came the flat, dismissive retort, a verdict delivered without a second glance. The hallway seemed to hold its breath as Daryl's challenge hung in the air, the charged silence a prelude to an inevitable reckoning. Just then, the double doors at the far end of the corridor swung open with a resonant clang. A woman clad in a severe black robe strode through, her eyes sharp as blades slicing through the disarray. Judge Whittaker, renowned for her uncompromising resolve and no-nonsense approach, surveyed the room with an intensity that brooked no delay. "What are you still doing out here?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a finely honed scalpel. In that moment, the entire atmosphere shifted. The dismissive air of the check-in desk evaporated as Daryl was beckoned forward. With a measured nod and a deep breath that carried the weight of countless past battles, he gathered his documents and followed the judge. Every step felt as if the very gravity of justice pulled him toward an uncertain climax. Yet even as he moved, a voice, a familiar, insidious echo, whispered from behind, "This isn't over." Though Daryl did not need to turn around to know its source, he felt the words coil in the back of his mind like a warning. Crossing the threshold into the courtroom was like stepping from a simmering tempest into a realm of exacting order. Polished wooden benches stretched in regimented rows, and hushed whispers wove through the air as attorneys conferred in near secrecy. A solitary bailiff, eyes fixed in silent vigilance, stood as an immovable sentinel near the judge's bench. The transformation was stark, a metamorphosis from the disordered chaos of the corridor to the refined, if tense, decorum of the court. Judge Whittaker settled into her seat with a deliberate grace, adjusting the microphone as if it were an extension of her authority. "Bailiff, please call the next case," she intoned. With a rustle of papers and the clack of typewritten files, a new chapter unfurled. Case number 24, Carter vs. Reynard Holdings. Daryl placed his briefcase carefully on the plaintiff's table, his heart pounding as his sharply dressed attorney, an embodiment of legal precision in his early 50s, leaned in with a look of quiet encouragement. "Let's just get this over with," Daryl murmured, a forced smile trembling on his lips. Opposite him, the legal team representing Reynard Holdings entered the arena like a well-rehearsed corporate drill, their matching gray suits exuding an air of cold entitlement. At the helm, their lead counsel, William Crestwell, reclined with a self-assured smirk that spoke of unassailable privilege. Before proceedings could fully commence, Judge Whittaker's hand rose in measured authority. "Before we begin, I must address an important matter," she declared, her tone leaving no room for evasion. The courtroom's buzz faded into a heavy, expectant hush. All eyes turned to Daryl, and a ripple of murmurs traversed the room as he stiffened in his seat. "Mr. Carter," she continued, her gaze unyielding, "it has come to my attention that despite your case being scheduled for a 9 a.m. hearing, you were made to wait outside for an extended period. Is that correct?" The question, simple yet damning, sent a shiver of anticipation through the crowd. "Yes, Your Honor," Daryl replied after a fleeting moment, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of suppressed indignation. A ripple of discontent passed among the assembled attorneys and observers. Judge Whittaker turned her steely attention toward the check-in officer, a man whose name, Officer Sanders, now seemed to hover in a spotlight of scrutiny. "Officer Sanders, is there an explanation for this delay?" she asked, her voice as crisp as a judge's gavel striking truth. Officer Sanders shifted in his seat, his expression faltering under the intensity of her stare. It was a mistake, Your Honor." "An oversight," he offered, his words stumbling out like fragile glass shards. But Judge Whittaker, having personally inspected Daryl's file, countered the officer's feeble explanation with a calm authority. "I have reviewed the records. Your file was stamped and cleared well before your arrival. Then why were you forced to wait?" A charged silence fell, punctuated only by the soft rustle of paper and the distant hum of whispered conversations. The opposing attorneys exchanged uneasy glances, and even Crestwell's signature smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by a shadow of uncertainty. Unable to hold back the mounting pressure, Daryl's voice broke the stillness. "What protocol demands that I be sidelined while others proceed without question?" His tone was neither accusatory nor belligerent, it was the quiet defiance of someone who had seen too many injustices unfold within these very walls. At that moment, a new figure approached the check-in desk, a dignified black woman in a striking red blazer, her small folder clutched close as though it were a talisman against systemic neglect. The officer's dismissive glance was repeated, his head jerked in the same lazy direction toward the waiting bench. The woman's resignation was palpable as she sank into her seat at the far end, her silence speaking volumes of battles long fought in vain. Time stretched on, each minute weighted with the collective tension of those left waiting. Then, as if orchestrated by some cruel conductor, a balding white man in an impeccably expensive suit burst in once again, muttering hurriedly about his tardiness. With barely a pause, he was ushered in by the officer, a gesture so swift it bordered on ritual. "Courtroom B, Mr. Hayes," the officer said, his tone as flat as if reading from a script. Unable to contain himself any longer, Darrell leapt to his feet. "Excuse me," he demanded, his controlled voice now edged with resolve. "I have been waiting for nearly 45 minutes. Why was I not called in when others were?" His question hung in the charged air, a spark poised to ignite the dormant embers of injustice. The officer's eyes met his, and in that brief moment, Darrell discerned a glimmer of condescension, an unspoken dismissal that stung like ice on raw skin. "You'll be called when they're ready," came the curt reply, devoid of any genuine concern. The words reverberated against the marble walls, a final verdict that offered no solace. Before the tension could escalate further, the double doors at the end of the hall creaked open once more. Judge Whittaker, her presence formidable and unyielding, strode forward. "What are you still doing out here?" she commanded, her gaze locking onto Darrell with a fierceness that silenced even the murmurs of the waiting crowd. In that instant, the air thickened, and every pair of eyes turned, some with quiet curiosity, others with thinly veiled disapproval. Reluctantly, Darrell rose and followed the judge through those imposing doors, each step echoing with the weight of impending accountability. The transition from the disorderly hallway to the meticulously arranged courtroom was as dramatic as stepping from a storm into a sanctum of judgment. Polished wood gleamed under the soft light, and every seat was filled with an audience poised between expectation and dread. Judge Whittaker took her seat at the bench with a measured authority, adjusting her microphone as though it were the instrument of fate. "Bailiff, call the next case," she instructed, and the room obeyed in a silent, almost ritualistic fashion. A file was opened, a cold, official document, case number 24, Carter vs. Reynard Holdings. Darrell set his briefcase on the plaintiff's table with a subdued finality. His attorney, whose sharp suit and sharper demeanor betrayed years of courtroom warfare, leaned over with a silent nod. "Let's just get this over with," Darrell murmured, forcing a smile that belied his inner turmoil. Across the room, the legal team for Reynard Holdings slipped into their seats. Their matching gray suits and polished airs gave them the aura of corporate monoliths, and at the center of their formation, William Crestwell reclined with a smirk that once spoke of unchallenged power. But before the proceedings could commence in earnest, Judge Whittaker raised her hand, halting the room's murmurs. "Before we begin," she intoned, "I must address a matter of procedural integrity." The tone was measured yet uncompromising, and the entire courtroom leaned in as though drawn by an irresistible gravity. Her eyes fixed on Darrell. "It has come to my attention that, despite your case being slated for a 9 a.m. hearing, you were compelled to wait outside for an undue length of time. Is that correct?" A murmur rippled through the room as Darrell replied, "Yes, Your Honor." His voice was steady, but each syllable carried the weight of injustice endured. A brief, tense pause followed before Judge Whittaker turned her piercing gaze to Officer Sanders. "Officer Sanders, explain this discrepancy. Was there a specific directive that delayed Mr. Carter's admittance?" Sanders, his posture betraying a sudden uncertainty, shifted under her unyielding stare. I was told to hold him back," he stammered, his eyes darting toward the opposing counsel as if seeking refuge. "It was merely an oversight, one of those rare miscommunications that occur when cases run high." But the judge's eyes were icy. "I personally reviewed Mr. Carter's file. It was cleared and stamped for court well before his arrival." "Then tell me, why was he not admitted promptly?" A ripple of disbelief and quiet outrage surged through the courtroom. From behind the rows of polished benches came whispers of discontent, even the composed attorneys of Reynard Holdings exchanged uneasy glances. Crestwell's smirk faltered, replaced by a strained mask of confidence. Unable to contain the mounting tension, Judge Whittaker pressed on, "Officer Sanders, are you suggesting that this delay was unintentional? Or was it part of a deliberate instruction?" Her voice, measured yet razor-sharp, cut through the thick silence. Sanders hesitated, his eyes betraying the weight of his next words. At length, with the pressure of countless expectant stares crushing him, he muttered, "I was told to slow the process, to hold back certain parties." His voice dropped to a near whisper that nonetheless resonated like a clarion call across the room. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. The implication was stark and undeniable. A decision had been made to delay Mr. Carter's hearing, and it appeared to have come from none other than the legal team of Reynard Holdings. A subtle, yet damning, shift occurred in the atmosphere as murmurs escalated into overt gasps and tense exhalations. Judge Whittaker's gaze swept the room, landing on Crestwell with a look that chilled the very air. "Mr. Crestwell," she said, her tone low and dangerous, "can you explain why instructions were issued to delay Mr. Carter's case?" For the first time that morning, Crestwell's carefully constructed facade crumbled. Leaning forward, palms pressed against the table, he forced out a laugh that sounded strained. "Your Honor, I have no idea what this man is talking about." His words, however, rang hollow as every fiber of his body language betrayed a quiet culpability. The judge's eyes narrowed, and the tension in the room became almost tangible. "Officer Sanders, you are under oath. I ask you once more, did anyone from the opposing firm instruct you to delay Mr. Carter's admittance?" Sanders' throat worked as he searched for an answer, beads of sweat gathering at his temple. Finally, in a voice scarcely audible above the collective heartbeat of the courtroom, he confessed, "I was told to hold things back." The admission, delivered in a trembling murmur, ignited a series of gasps and frantic whispers among the gathered spectators. The room's energy shifted palpably as Judge Whittaker leaned back, her expression a study in steely resolve. "This was not a mere administrative error," she pronounced, her tone brooking no contradiction. "This was a deliberate act of obstruction, a manipulation of the very scales of justice." As the reverberations of her words filled the courtroom, Crestwell's once confident demeanor crumbled entirely. Across the room, attorneys scribbled furiously in their notebooks, their eyes wide with the realization that this case had veered into dangerous, uncharted territory. "Therefore," Judge Whittaker continued, her voice resonating like a judge's final verdict, "I will be filing a formal complaint with the State Bar for legal misconduct. Interfering with court proceedings to gain an advantage is unacceptable, and you, Mr. Crestwell, will answer for it." A heavy silence fell over the courtroom as Crestwell's smirk vanished entirely, replaced by a grim resignation. Meanwhile, Officer Sanders was quietly escorted from the room by a stern bailiff, his head bowed in defeat. The very air seemed to vibrate with the weight of accountability and the raw, unyielding truth of the moment. For Darrell, the proceedings took on a transformative quality. His pulse, which had thundered in protest mere minutes before, now steadied as a profound sense of vindication settled in his chest. The burden of quiet injustice, the relentless waiting, the cold dismissal, had been forcefully challenged in that hallowed chamber of law. When the session finally resumed, Judge Whittaker's gaze swept the courtroom with a lingering intensity. "We shall proceed with today's case as scheduled," she declared, her tone both resolute and measured. "But let it be known that this court does not tolerate attempts to subvert justice." As the opposing team shuffled uncomfortably in their seats, and Darrell's attorney offered a brief, knowing nod, the courtroom's atmosphere was irrevocably altered. Outside, the same gray walls and cold tile floors awaited, but within, a small victory had been etched into the annals of that storied courthouse. After the final proceedings, Darrell stepped back into the corridor with a mind awash in conflicting emotions. The heavy weight that had pressed upon him since that dismal morning had lightened ever so slightly. He could see Crestwell storming out, his once arrogant stride replaced by a furtive, subdued composure, and Officer Sanders, escorted with his head hung low, a silent testament to the cost of unchecked authority. Standing once more before the same check-in desk, now a silent witness to a day of reckoning, Darrell pondered the quiet injustices that had long gone unchallenged. How many others had been forced to wait, to be ignored, until their voices were nearly extinguished? Today, the scales had begun to tip, if only just a fraction, in favor of fairness. A familiar, measured voice called his name from behind. Turning, Darrell met the gaze of Judge Whittaker herself, who now lingered near the exit. "I meant what I said in there," she confided softly, the stern lines of her face softened by a trace of empathy. "I won't let this go." Darrell nodded, his eyes reflecting both fatigue and a newfound resolve. "I know," he replied, the quiet certainty of his words reverberating in the corridor. For a long moment, they simply stood in mutual acknowledgement of a shared battle, a fight against an often indifferent system. Then, as the courthouse door swung shut behind him, Darrell paused to take in one last look at the desk where it all began. A spark of determination flickered within him. "Not today," he whispered to the silent hall, his grip tightening on his briefcase. Today, the system had no choice but to answer for itself. And so, as the weight of the morning's injustices slowly receded, a call to arms stirred in the hearts of those who witnessed it, a plea to speak up against the quiet tyranny of indifference. If you believe in challenging injustice, if you believe that every small act of resistance matters, then let this story be a beacon. Share it widely, raise your voice whenever you see wrong, and remember, the fight for fairness does not end in the courthouse. It begins with people like you, determined to stand against silence, to ensure that every injustice is met with the unwavering demand for accountability. The day had not erased the scars of past neglect, but it had carved a new chapter in the long struggle for justice, a chapter that would echo in the halls of power for as long as voices dared to rise.